Andrei Chikatilo was a vicious serial killer. Over the course of 12 years, he violently murdered 53 women and children. He was also the last Soviet serial killer. Most of his victims lived in the Rostov region of Russia. As a result, he received three infamous nicknames: Butcher of Rostov, Red Ripper, and Rostov Ripper. And the stories of his killings led to more people becoming serial killers. For example, Alexander Pishikin, known as the Board Killer. For every person he murdered, he would mark a chessboard and try to fill its 64 squares to surpass the number of people Chikatilo had murdered. Andrei Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in Yablonnoy, a village in the heart of rural Ukraine in the USSR. Chikatilo's parents were farm laborers and lived in a one-room hut. As a child, he would often be beaten by his parents for wetting the bed. However, it was discovered that he was born with brain damage that affected his ability to control his semen and bladder discharge, which is what caused him to wet the bed so often. At the age of 5, his mother told him that he had once had an older brother who disappeared before he was born, based on the speculation that his brother was eaten by hungry neighbors. But according to history, this story is most likely true, because during that time period, there was a great famine in Ukraine. In the late 1920s, the Soviet Union began industrialization, and in order to solve the problem of insufficient food and raw materials, the Soviet government launched a campaign to collectivize agriculture. In Ukraine, however, this policy was met with strong resistance, with many peasants refusing to join collective farms and even resorting to destructive behavior. The Soviet government forcibly collected grain and even arrested and exiled peasants who opposed collectivization. In 1932, even though there were already signs of famine in Ukraine, the Soviet government continued to requisition large quantities of grain from Ukraine in order to fulfill its grain export mandate. By 1933, the famine had worsened, yet the Soviet government continued to prohibit the flow of grain into Ukraine from other regions, while forbidding the victims to leave the country in search of food. Without food, hungry people feed on human beings. Moreover, according to statistics, the Great Famine in Ukraine has caused millions of people to die of hunger and related diseases. On September 1, 1939, World War II began. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched an all-out attack on the Soviet Union and used a blitzkrieg to capture most of the Ukrainian territory. In 1943, Chikatilo's father was drafted into the army, and during that year his sister was born. During the war, the Sumy Oblast experienced heavy fighting and suffered very serious damage and casualties. Chikatilo witnessed the German blitzkrieg, and their house was destroyed in the fighting. Also, his father was captured by the Germans and was not released by the U.S. Army until 1949, and instead of being rewarded for his war service, he was called a traitor for surrendering to Germany. Eventually, Chikatilo became very shy and introverted, and after publicly denouncing his father as a coward, he also became the target of bullying by his peers. But this introversion also contributed to his ability to read, and as a teenager he developed a passion for communist literature, which led to his appointment as chairman of his school's Student Communist Committee. It wasn't until Chikatilo discovered that he suffered from chronic erectile dysfunction that he became more self-conscious and shy, to the point where he was afraid to be alone with women. At this point, his self-hatred as well as his curiosity about women reached its peak. Chikatilo's only sexual act as a youth was at the age of 17, when he pinned his sister's 11-year-old friend to the ground and fought with her. When the girl tried to get out of his control, he reached an orgasm, which opened him up to more ridicule. In 1953, Chikatilo completed his studies and applied for a scholarship to Moscow State University. Although he passed the entrance exams, his grades were not good enough to be accepted. Between 1957 and 1960, he performed mandatory military service in the army. After his discharge, he became a telephone engineer, installing telephone sets and maintaining telephone lines. In 1963, Chikatilo married a woman who was a friend of his sister. Before they started having sex, he made it clear that he suffered from sexual dysfunction and that, in order to pass on his sexuality, they used their fingers to push semen into their vaginas. Through this method, in 1965, they had a daughter, and by 1969, a son. In 1971, Chikatilo completed a correspondence course in Russian literature and received a degree from Rostov University. Afterwards, he obtained a teaching position at a school in Novosakhtinsk. However, over the course of several years, he was repeatedly accused of sexually harassing students, and as a result, his teaching career came to an end. In September 1978, Chikatilo moved to a coal mining town called Shakht near Rostov-on-Don, where he found a new job in a factory. While living alone in a house, he began to have pedophilic fantasies. Every day, he spies on children from a shack down the street. Every serial killer starts with the first victim, which usually sets the tone for the rest of the murders that follow. On December 22nd, Chikatilo lured a 9-year-old girl named Yelena Zakotnova to an old house he had previously purchased in secret. There, he attempted to rape the little girl, but due to erectile dysfunction, he did not manage to do so. So in anger, he took a knife and stabbed the little girl 3 times in a row, killing her as she tried to struggle. But during the course of the murder, he had an orgasm. 2 days later, the little girl's body was found, and a great deal of evidence pointed to Chikatilo. Blood was found in the snow near the old house he had purchased. Neighbors noticed him at the house on the evening of December 22nd, and witnesses gave evidence to the police that just before the little girl's disappearance, a man who looked like Chikatilo had spoken to her at the bus stop just before she disappeared. Despite all the evidence pointing to Chikatilo, a scapegoat emerged. A 25-year-old man named Alexander Kravchenko, who had committed the rape and murder of a girl as a youth, was arrested. During the trial, even though he insisted on his innocence, and even though there was no evidence that he was the murderer, he was eventually executed under pressure from the girl's family. On September 3rd, 1981, Chikatilo's second murder was committed. At that time, after a failed attempt to have sex with a 17-year-old boarding school girl, Larisa Kachenko, in the woods next to the Don River, he became enraged and beat and eventually strangled her. Not having a knife, he used his teeth and a tree branch to destroy the corpse's phallic appearance. On June 12, 1982, Chikatilo was returning home from a shopping trip in the hamlet of East Sky when he happened upon the 13-year-old girl Lybov Burjak. He walked with her and tried to strike up a conversation. To prevent witnesses, he kept looking around, and after making sure no one was around, he tackled Burjak to the ground, dragged her to a nearby grove, tore her dress, and stabbed and slashed her to death. After murdering 3 people and realizing that no police had arrested him, Chikatilo could no longer restrain his desire to kill. Between July and September 1982, he killed no fewer than 5 children between the ages of 9 and 19 years. Chikatilo created the illusion for everyone that he would disguise himself as a young drifter, and then, while at a bus or train station, he would lure his victims to nearby woods or other secluded places, and then kill them to the point that everyone would think that these were crimes committed by drifters. His targets were very specific: young girls and young children. His methods of murder were also very brutal. After he attempted to rape, he would take a knife and stab his victims continuously before destroying their bodies. Among the victims found during these 2 months were the 14-year-old girl, Lybov Vorobyeva, killed in Krasnodar on July 25, 1982. The 9-year-old boy, Oleg Bozdev, killed on August 13, 1982. The 16-year-old girl, Olga Kaplina, killed on August 16, 1982. The 19-year-old girl, Arina Karabelnikova, killed on September 8, 1982. 15-year-old boy, Sergei Kuzmin, killed on September 15, 1982. 10-year-old girl, Olga Stolmakinak, killed on December 11, 1982. All 6 victims were essentially runaway children, or children who had accidentally wandered away due to crowds of people. Over the next 6 months, Chikatilo stopped his murders for no apparent reason. The next victim was Laura Sarkisian, a 15-year-old Armenian girl. Before the end of the summer, Chikatilo claimed 3 more victims. Luda Katsuba, a 24-year-old female, an unidentified female between the ages of 18 and 25, and Igor Gudkov, a 7-year-old boy. By September 1983, the total number of victims had risen to 14, 6 of whose bodies were found. Concerned by the reported death toll, the local militia formed an investigative team. By the time the investigative team saw the gruesome state of the scene, they quickly determined that the crimes were committed by a serial killer and frantically criticized the local police for their incompetence. Since the murders were concentrated in the Rostov region, the investigation team focused on this area as well. However, until September 1984, the investigation team failed to find any usable evidence other than the blood type of the murderer, which did not prove who the murderer was. To make matters worse, while the investigating team and the police struggled to find clues, the murders accelerated at an alarming rate, and the number of murdered victims had reached a staggering 32 in the intervening 2 years. As a result, the police had placed more officers around the bus station as well as the train station, as they had also discovered that the killer seemed to be very fond of luring his victims, especially the young women and boys, in these high-traffic areas. On the first day, a police officer on patrol noticed a very suspicious man, a middle-aged man wearing glasses, who, although he looked ordinary on the surface, always stared at the crowd, especially the young girls. After continuing to watch him for some time, the police found him and asked him for his identity documents. While the middle-aged man was very nervous, he trembled and said, "He is on a business trip and he is getting ready to get on the bus back home right now." The police officers double-checked his ID and left. However, the middle-aged man was Chikatilo. A few weeks later, the officers saw Chikatilo again at the bus station. They noticed that Chikatilo had been sitting on a stool and was constantly watching the young women around him. This time, the officers did not go up to Chikatilo. They just followed him and watched as he continued to pick up women of all ages and tried to engage them in conversation. They realized that even though Chikatilo was constantly being rejected, he still tried to approach others. For hours, the only thing Chikatilo did was talk to women. After an hour, Chikatilo finally struck up a conversation. It was with a drunken young woman, and their conversation went so well that within a few minutes, Chikatilo had his arm around her. After 10 minutes or so, the woman put her head in his lap while he put his hand up the woman's shirt and kept touching her. When the young woman was gone, the police couldn't wait any longer. They found Chikatilo, checked his papers again, and asked to check his briefcase. The police were shocked because they found a rope, a jar of Vaseline, and a long-bladed knife in the briefcase. Thus, Chikatilo was detained. During the Soviet era, detainees faced varying lengths of detention, which could range from months to decades. In this detention, Chikatilo was accused of harassing women in public places, but in a more in-depth investigation, they found out that Chikatilo was being investigated for stealing a roll of linoleum and a car battery. And they also learned of his fascination with children, especially girls. The evidence seemed to indicate that Chikatilo might be the murderer they were looking for, but even blood tests were inconclusive. Since there was insufficient evidence to charge him with murder, he was later charged with burglary and sentenced to 1 year in prison. In December 1984, after serving only 3 months of his sentence, he was released. Upon his release, Chikatilo made a low-profile move to New Cherkassk to work. It was not until August 1st, 1985, on a train, that he met an 18-year-old girl, Natalia Poklistova. Chikatilo told her, "If you will get off the train with me, then I will give you some vodka." She agreed and followed him to a small forest. So, a few hours later, she was naked and stabbed 38 times in quick succession. By the time Chikatilo got home, he met a runaway young woman, Irina Guliev, at the bus stop. She told Chikatilo that if she could be provided with lodging, then she would provide free sex. Chikatilo agrees. He takes her to a heavily wooded area and tries to have sex with her, but he is still unable to get an erection, and an enraged Chikatilo simply kills her. Chikatilo stopped his murders for the next year, 1986. During that year, the investigative team re-examined the information on the series of murders, and in an effort to narrow down the possibilities, they approached dozens of psychologists and forensic scientists and asked them to analyze them to determine the killer's age and physical data. But most of the experts refused to assist on the grounds that they didn't have enough information to analyze. Only one of the psychiatrists was willing to help, although he had little to base his analysis on. After studying the file, he concluded that the murderer had probably suffered sexual stigmatization, which was why he had harmed his victims with great cruelty. On May 16, 1987, Chikatilo committed another murder, although he did not act in Rostov, but killed a 13-year-old boy, Oleg Makarenkov, while he was on business in Levda, in the Ural Mountains region. On July 27th of the same year, Chikatilo killed a 12-year-old boy, Ivan Bilovetsky, in Zaporozhye, Ukraine. The murder was so brutal that part of Chikatilo's knife blade broke off, and pieces of the knife were later found by police at the scene. On September 15th of the same year, Chikatilo went on to murder a 16-year-old boy, Yuri Tarasanok, in Leningrad. In April 1988, Chikatilo continued to begin his killings. Between April 1st and 4th, he murdered a woman between the ages of 18 and 25 in Red Surin. On May 15th of the same year, Chikatilo killed a 9-year-old boy, Alexei Voronko, in Ilovaisk, Ukraine. On July 14th of the same year, he murdered a 15-year-old boy, Evgeny Miratov. In 1989, Chikatilo murdered 5 people. A 16-year-old girl, Tatiana Rezhova, who was killed on March 8, 1989. An 8-year-old boy, Alexander Dyakonov, who was killed on May 11, 1989. 10-year-old boy, Mo Alexei Isiv, who was killed on June 20, 1989. 19-year-old Hungarian schoolgirl, Helena Volko, who was killed on August 19, 1989. The 10-year-old boy, Alexei Hobotov, who was killed on August 29, 1989. Chikatilo's next murder did not take place until January 1990. In his last year of freedom, Chikatilo seemed to have shed his preference for women, and 6 of the 8 victims were young boys. On November 6, 1990, after Chikatilo had killed his last victim, he was stopped by a plainclothes policeman patrolling the train station. At this point, Chikatilo's bag was containing the victim's body parts, but he did not examine them. He gave Chikatilo a cursory look at his identification and let Chikatilo go. By the time the police found the remains of the last victim, they had determined that Chikatilo was the serial killer. On November 20, 1990, Chikatilo went out to buy beer, and on the way he was aimlessly having fun with kids he didn't know. And when Chikatilo bought only 300 milliliters of beer for a 1-gallon bottle, the police arrested him. On the day of his arrest, he was carrying a briefcase containing a knife, a piece of rope, and a jar of Vaseline. These items were identical to those he was carrying when he was last arrested 6 years ago. Shortly after his arrest, Chikatilo was photographed and briefly interviewed before being placed in a KGB isolation cell. But it was not until November 30th when a psychiatrist assured Chikatilo that he would explain to Chikatilo's family that there was a mental disorder causing all of this behavior, that Chikatilo dropped his guard and began to reveal the facts of his murder. Chikatilo described in detail how he had tracked down, raped, and brutally murdered those victims. Over time, he continued to confess to more murders, detailing how he raped, murdered, and brutalized his victims, sometimes removing body parts, eating them, and drinking their blood. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia became independent. Since Chikatilo's murder was the most serious case during the Soviet period, all Russian citizens remained concerned about Chikatilo's trial. On October 15, 1992, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was convicted of 52 counts of murder, and one of the charges was dropped due to lack of evidence. On January 4, 1994, then Russian President Boris Yeltsin, who denied Chikatilo's appeal for a reduced sentence. On February 14th, Chikatilo was taken to a soundproof room, where the executioner ended Chikatilo's life by firing a single shot through his right ear. The words of Andrei Chikatilo's psychoanalysis. Since, as a child, he was beaten by his parents for bedwetting and had brain damage that resulted in weak control of semen and bladder discharge, he may have grown up with chronic low self-esteem and repression. This early physical impairment and violent treatment from his parents may have undermined his self-perception and sense of security. And learning that his brother may have been eaten by hungry neighbors and the horrific experience of the Holodomor in Ukraine further deepened his fear and distrust of the world. Growing up in such an environment may have made him cold and cruel at heart. Witnessing the German Blitzkrieg during the war, the destruction of his house, being considered a traitor after his father was captured, and being the target of bullying by his peers were experiences that further plunged him into isolation and helplessness. Chronic erectile dysfunction made him more self-conscious and shy to face women alone. This sexual dysfunction not only affected his sex life, but also dealt a serious blow to his self-esteem and male dignity. This may have led him to develop complex emotions towards women, both desire and anger. The first time he killed a man, he had an orgasm during the murder despite the attempted rape, which may have led him to discover a unique way of releasing his inner pressure and satisfying his twisted desires. In particular, the society at that time was not sufficiently aware of and concerned about psychological problems and did not provide him with timely and effective psychological intervention and help. From the time the psychiatrist expressed understanding of him, he was like a child who had cried for a long time and finally received parental love.